Would you say you live in a posture of curiosity? Thanks for joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and this is the second of our collaboration episodes with Zoweh, a nonprofit mission that encourages men, women, and marriages by creating tools, resources, and community spaces that invite people to experience inner healing, intimate connection with God and with others. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Zoweh staff members, Scott and Sherry Jennings, and you are not going to want to miss this one. They're going to discuss how God redeemed the brokenness of their marriage.
But I think you can spiritually, emotionally, mentally divorce one another and still be legally married. And that was certainly our case.
Here's my conversation with Scott and Sherry Jennings. So excited that we are continuing our collaboration with Zoweh, and they are just providing resources for men and women and marriages where people can share their story and be seen and known by God, but also by others. So today we're joined with Scott and Sherry Jennings, and they are going to share one of their very big parable stories with us today. Scott and Sherry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Mm-hmm. So guys, tell me a little bit, how did you guys meet each other? That's my question I always go to when I meet a couple. Was it love at first sight?
Yeah, we have a little bit of a unusual story when it comes to that. When you meet people in full-time ministry, oftentimes you don't have this kind of story where we actually met at a college keg party at UConn. Yeah, I was a freshman and Sherry was a senior at the time. Sherry's a little bit older than I am. And she didn't pay any attention to me whatsoever at that party because I was so young compared to her. But we met. But then I think it was February the following year, right? So February of 1989, we met each other again. And then sparks started to fly.
He noticed me from across the room, met my eyes, followed my every move that night. And then he and his brother came to visit because his brother had a crush on my roommate. And so they came down to Connecticut to spend the weekend with us. And we've been together pretty much ever since.
We really have. Yeah, we got married in September of 1991. I don't know that it was love at first sight, but it didn't take long.
You know what? I love it when people say like we met at a keg party, because the reality is like our lives are just so multifaceted, and you know, God like meets us where we are at. So
True.
When people are saying, you know, well, we met at church and in Bible study, we prayed and Jesus was there immediately, then I'm like, oh, okay.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Good. Yeah.
Good for you.
Not our story.
Oh, okay. Well, Sherry, tell us about where you guys live. You both are on staff at Zoweh, so tell us a little bit about what you do there.
So what we do here, we've been here for 6 or 7 years now, and it's been my heart's desire to invite women into this larger story, the story of more love, more life, more freedom. And I think what drew us to Zoweh, gosh, I feel like we're skipping ahead in our story, but having gone through a divorce, we divorced each other on our 14th wedding anniversary, and then reconciling pretty quickly afterwards as a result of starting to walk with Jesus and listening to all of the radio shows back then on how to have a better marriage, how to start your marriage over again, how to be married the right way. That sustained for a while, but realizing when we encountered Zoweh that there is so much more to our lives and to marriage than just how-tos. Entering into our stories, exploring our stories, my story, exploring his story and getting to know Scott's story, and then our story together has been life-changing. And then being able to offer that, invite others to explore their story with God and their marriage story with God.
I would say one of the things I get to do at Zoweh is to direct the resource division, and we try to create environments and resources where men and women and couples can experience intimacy, oneness, and connectedness with God, because that is what changes things. And it's less about a list of, 5 things to have a wonderful marriage or, 6 ways to get closer to God. It's really trying to, especially at our weekends, but through our resources as well, trying to create opportunities for people to go back in their story and back into the journey that they've been on and maybe re-examine some things with God and then enter into the journey with God moving forward. Mm-hmm. We're so often tied to, even unknowingly tied to what's happened to us in our history, in our story. And what happens to us influences how we interact with the world, how we perceive God, how we perceive others. And it really can be a hindrance. And so, as Sherry talked about our divorce and reconciliation, where we got to was a place where we felt like, okay, we got some great tools from ministries like Family Life, which is a part of Campus Crusade. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to them because of how helpful they were about helping us understand biblical truth about marriage. But what got in the way of us applying that biblical truth was our own history and our own story and the way that we operated out of what we refer to at Zoweh as our false self, and rather than the true identity that God has for us.
I'm sure for the listener, they're just like, wait a second, you were married after you met at a keg party and then you were divorced 14 years later. Yeah. For those listening, we are going to get into that story. This is the parable that they are going to share today. But prior to that, I'd love for both of you to kind of talk about, like, what was your faith like growing up, like leading into marriage? Where was God? What did you think of him? Like, did that mean anything to you, or was that just something that you did a couple Sundays a year?
I grew up Catholic, but not really practicing. It was a once a week thing we did as a family for that hour on Sunday morning, but it really didn't have any bearing on the rest of my life.
Yeah, and I remember going to church one time as a child. My parents baptized me when I was about 9 years old at a little congregational church in Massachusetts where I grew up. And I don't remember ever going back. And we didn't talk about God. He wasn't a part of our life. So yeah, there was not a lot of that influence growing up at all.
Mm-hmm. So leading up to the point where you guys got married, even like when maybe you started having, I don't know, do you guys have kids at all?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sometimes that's some of the conversation starters of like, well, if we're going to get married, like, how are we going to raise our kids? Like, what was that conversation like as you first got married?
Because I grew up with really no church background at all, and Sherry kind of grew up as a 2 or 3 time a year Catholic, we decided, well, we'll just get married in the Catholic Church. And so we went to a preparing for marriage seminar that they provided. And then we met with the priest that did our ceremony, and he said, I've got 2 words of advice for you as you enter into marriage. He said, raise your kids Catholic and learn to say yes, dear. So that was my premarital counseling. Right. Not particularly helpful. And I'm not trying to be disparaging about the Catholic Church or priests or anything like that. That was just our experience, and it really wasn't helpful. It was more something, that we did because I think we were expected to do it. Than it being a part of our lives.
Yeah, and I would say the pretty much the only conversation we had about kids was I really didn't want any. So it really seemed like that was a non-conversation. And it wasn't until after your father passed away that, I don't know, there was a reset in me that said, okay, maybe we should have one.
Yeah.
I always kind of laugh when people say that they've gone to marriage counseling and the pastor or the priest has never experienced marriage. They're like, here's what you got to do, and here's your 5-step plan. I'm just like, okay. I'm glad that you haven't had experience in that, but we'll take it for what it's worth. Well, I'd love to really jump into your parable story, and maybe you guys can decide on where you would like to start. Maybe if that is where the uneasiness or even the idea of divorce came into your head. I mean, you were married for 14 years. So take us back to that point and then where that trajectory and the story plays out for you guys.
We typically start in with how we were raised, so you covered that one. And then I guess next I would say that I was raised to be a strong and independent woman and that I really didn't need a man. But Scott was just so funny and so fun to be with and so adorable that we got married. And I was moving out of my wounds, as we talked about earlier, out of that smaller story. And in the construction field, if you can imagine, and in property management, I was a rather large and overbearing, and I would even say now toxic presence. Like the way I would speak to the men in construction, I don't know that I discerned and spoke to Scott any differently. I was not necessarily kind to him. I was not encouraging. I was certainly not a safe and soft place for him to come home to at the end of the day. So I know that that created a great deal of distance between us.
Yeah, and I would say, not to pile on, but I think you think like so many, we were not taught anything about leaving and cleaving. Mm-hmm. It was not even, that I can recall, not even mentioned. And so when we got married, the number one man in your life was still your dad.
Yeah, very true. I called him.
Which was very hard for me. That was diminishing to me. And so, without any kind of frame of reference or really anyone or anything to fall back on, I started to try to find that affirmation and encouragement anywhere else that I could, because I wasn't going to find it from Sherry. And so early in our marriage, I decided, I was going to attend the fire academy, and I became a firefighter and found lots of encouragement and lots of affirmation there. That really the affirmation structure that I was looking for, where I could achieve and get awards, and I became the youngest lieutenant in the department. And so what that led to was a pattern of behavior where we moved further and further apart from one another. So the way I like to describe it is, we got married on an altar, and because we had not been given many tools, and even if we had been given the tools, I'm not certain we would have utilized them at the time, because, when you're young, you have it all figured out. But we walked down off of that. I say that firmly, tongue in cheek. We walked down off of the altar and up that aisle of the church, and we were side by side walking in a parallel trajectory. Well, it didn't take long before we just slightly turned away from each other. And so what happens over time, if there's any pilots or sailors out there, if you deviate off of your trajectory, even by the slightest tenth of a degree, you don't notice it immediately. But over the course of time, 6, 7, 8, 14 years, we ended up miles apart.
Sherry, I'd love to ask you, you said that you were a strong and independent woman. I don't know if that was ingrained in you as a child. Like, that's just like the environment that you grew up at. Even for those people who are not married, like, there is this part of us as Christians, just as people, like, there's that human nature that we want to do things on our own. I'd love for you to speak into that of, looking back at it now, you can say, wow, like, I was really wrapped up in that independence, and that independence, it kind of took away from my marriage.
Oh, it surely did. Being the one who does it all, who doesn't need anyone, leaves no place for Scott in my life, left no place for my husband. And when I did need, it's funny now that I think about it this way, but when I needed something fixed, or I had questions about the car,
something you couldn't do,
something I couldn't accomplish, it wasn't Scott that I called my dad. Or if I did tell Scott and he had a solution, I would say, well, you really should call my dad. And so leaning into that was really unhealthy for the marriage and for me, because we're not created to do this alone. You're not created to be that kind of independent, to be the independent who doesn't need anyone else, because we do. We were created for relationship. We were created for community.
Yeah, and I would just comment and say that, in the context of marriage, God brings people together as, I believe, perfect gift for one another. We're designed for one another by God. There's no coincidences when it comes to who he brings together. And so I would say that there's an opportunity for us to complete one another rather than compete with one another, right? But even in the context of singleness, there are people in your life that God brings along, even if it's not for a marriage prospect or opportunity, however you want to say that. But there's people in your life, there's people here on the team at Zoweh that really own me as a person, as a man, and help me to be a better person. And I think that's how God created community, and it's part of his design.
Scott, I love that you said that, because I think community is important. So whether you are married, if you have chosen to be single in your life, or maybe you're in a season where your spouse has passed on, even in co-worker relationships, community is important. Because when you're talking about being at the altar, I was thinking, like, we are God's bridegroom. Like we are in that same relationship. So whether if you're listening and you're not married, like we all are going to have this like struggle of like pulling away and like coming back together. And Jesus is the only one that can complete and restore that within us. If you guys could take me back to the point where you're like, this is enough. Like I've had enough. And who said like, it's time for the divorce? Was that a mutual decision or was that only on one end?
Yeah, that was a pretty tumultuous time for sure. A friend of Scott's actually had invited me to go through the purpose-driven life with her. She was going to have a small group. And I said, what have I got to lose? I mean, this marriage thing is hard. This is not the way it's supposed to be. This fighting and making up and fighting and making up. And he's drinking too much and he's gone all the time. You know, this just isn't working. So embarked on that study with a very small group of women. And I know that that was God's provision for us in this, for me to be able to start walking with him, to start surrendering my life to him, to allow him to start to change my countenance and my ways, and to prepare me for learning of an affair that he had been in for a year. Because had I learned about that affair before this group, before walking with Jesus, I would have kicked him to the curb. I didn't need him. He was having an affair. So, I mean, the world would certainly say, kick that man to the curb. But instead, because my heart had already been broken for what I was experiencing, for the way that I was living, my heart was broken for Scott and for what he was enduring, even in the midst of choosing something that was totally out of bounds and totally not acceptable, totally not okay, totally heartbreaking. I knew it was out of desperation for air, out of desperation for love and validation and some semblance of those things, right? Those were cheap substitutes for what I should have been, or I could have been, we could have been experiencing
God's
together.
design.
Yeah, God's design. So that was sort of the setup and the startup, and that led me to counselors and wanting counseling and confronting Scott and wanting him to engage with counselors with me. But he had very little interest. And so because he was driving drunk and being afraid that we could lose everything, and with the hope that we could reconcile, that this wouldn't end in divorce, because I'm a new Christian and I'm reading that God hates divorce. So last thing I want to do is something that he hates. I filed for divorce to protect everything that we had built together, so that while he's driving drunk, while he's doing all those things, that perhaps we would still have something for him to come home to.
Yeah, and I would say, Danielle, leading up to that, as a firefighter, at the time, there really wasn't a lot available in the context of counseling or help for what I was a firefighter. I was a member of the rescue squad. I was medically trained. We had a Marine division because we were on the coast of Connecticut. And so I was seeing all kinds of awful things that you're really not designed to see. And the culture at the time was one that if that bothered you, you should just quit, because you're obviously not designed for this. And so I looked for a number of different ways. And when Sherry talks about me abusing alcohol, it was one of the ways that I looked for a method to medicate post-traumatic stress. And that included alcohol, that included prescription drugs, that included risky behavior, that included being involved in affairs. And so all of that was untenable in the context of our relationship, and finally led Sherry to a point where she was praying with God about divorce, about divorcing me. And God said to her, if you don't divorce him, I can't bring you the Christian husband I have for you. Wow. And so Sherry's reply to that
was, well, gosh, okay, I can do this, but God, can it be Scott? Will you redeem him? Will he be the Christian husband you have for me?
Which is just an enormous doesn't even justify, or it's not a sufficient word to describe the leap of faith that was for Sherry, because I was living with a girlfriend across town at the time. Wow. And she would take Ephesians chapter 5, which talks about husbands loving your wives like Christ loved the church. And she would insert, wherever there was a pronoun, she would insert my name and read the scripture as a prayer for me.
Psalm 139.
And Psalm 139 also. Yeah.
Wow.
And so it was a journey of faith for Sherry. And so we divorced on the day of our 14th wedding anniversary, September 21st, 2005, 14 years to the day. And I went really off the rails after that and wound up in a hotel room alone and was contemplating ending my life. And had thought about how I was going to do that. And so Sherry called my eldest sister, Nancy, and Nancy called me in the hotel room where I was holed up. And she said, there's a Bible in the drawer next to your bed there. Why don't you take it out and I'll read it to you? And so one of the verses that she read to me really has become etched on my heart since that moment. It's Isaiah 55 verses 7 and 8. Let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts and return back to God, for he will freely pardon. And so it chokes me up now because I think about that man that was in that hotel room and how desperate he was. And what I didn't know at the time, Danielle, was that I was desperate for the love of God. I was desperate for Jesus to come and rescue me. And so a few days later, I'm on the road to North Carolina, going down to stay at a family place. It was actually my mom's place, and she was going to be gone for 3 weeks. And I thought, man, I'll just go down there while she's gone and figure out what's next. So the Friday is when I was in the hotel room. I hit the road, stayed overnight halfway down. And on Sunday morning, I got up and got in my truck and turned the radio on, and a pastor came on. And I didn't normally listen to the radio at the time, but God arranged for it. And a pastor came on and said, if you're at the bottom of the pit that you've dug with your own 2 hands and you need someone to come down in there and rescue you, say this prayer with me and welcome Jesus into your heart. And so I was driving down the road at the time, and I pulled over and I thought, I've seen the change in Sherry's countenance. She talks about Jesus all the time. She talks about how Jesus is the great Redeemer. She's been praying for me. And I definitely did see a change in her. She was a different person. And so I thought, I've got nothing to lose. I've got one way to go or the other. And it's really life or death at this point. So I gave it a shot. And I felt this redemptive love come over me and had hope for the first time in a long time. And so when I got to North Carolina, I reached out through my sister to Sherry. Sherry was not interested in talking to me at that time because as far as she knew, I was still the guy she had divorced. Sure. But my sister told her that I had this conversion experience in it and that it seemed real. And so Sherry agreed to read The Purpose-Driven Life with me, and we would email each other our thoughts because she wasn't ready to talk to me, our thoughts on each day. And then that led to more conversation.
Right, because I was super cautious. He'd been incredibly manipulative for 4 years, and I didn't want my hopes and desires and longing for what I had been hopeful for to not be coming to fruition. I didn't want to be wrong in that. I wanted to take it really slow because I figured, we didn't get to the place we were overnight, and we weren't going to get to a redemptive place overnight.
Yeah, we needed a lot of healing.
We did.
Well, Scott, first, thank you for sharing that with me. But I know you guys share this probably at Zoweh events, and this is a part of your story. So when we share like this, we are able to say, wow, I can see what God has done in both of your lives, the place that you were at and where he has taken you from. Not to say that you've never had any mess up since then, but in that moment at your lowest, God is still saying, I will redeem this situation. And so you guys worked through that book. How long did that take you, and what started to shift after that?
I had a real change of heart, obviously, because I had a new heart, but there were things that we still needed to work through. And so God granted me a compassion and a care for Sherry and her heart as we even started to talk to one another again. And so whatever the parameters were that she put out, I wanted to respect them, including, we didn't talk for the first 2.5 weeks. We just emailed each day. And then it went on from there.
Right. And I don't think we got through the whole 40 days before I realized, okay, you can't make this up. The old Scott cannot make up what he is sharing with me in response to each day of this book. And I began to realize, oh my gosh, this is the Christian husband that God has brought me. I mean, he's brought me Scott. He's redeeming Scott. There was a tenderness and a kindness to him that I had not seen in years since we married. honestly.
Yeah.
And so that's when I said, okay, we're going to do this. We didn't get what we needed the first time we got married. So there's this thing called Family Life. I've been listening on the radio. They have a weekend to remember. You book one. There's one coming up in Philadelphia. It was halfway between where he was staying, where I was living. And so he booked it.
Yeah. I mean, God worked it all out. So I was staying in North Carolina at the time. And this is really, about 2.5 months after the divorce?
Yeah.
My sister was nearby to there, so our son, Stephen, who was 10 at the time, could go stay with my sister. Sherry came down from Connecticut. We went and we heard biblical truth about marriage that we just had not heard before.
Yeah.
We were so excited about what God was doing in our relationship with him and with each other, and about the redemptive story of our marriage, that we actually went to a staff opportunities meeting at that very first weekend to remember. And I'll never forget, the man that was running the meeting said, okay, well, get some counseling, get remarried, because we were not married again yet when we went to the weekend to remember. So get remarried and then come back and see us, you know? Yeah. So we went and did that. We spent about a year and a half just courting each other once again, pursuing God, pursuing healing, and move towards reconciliation. And our story, I have to say, we were so excited about what God was doing in our story, in our marriage, that we really, at the time, we overlooked our son and how traumatic all that was for him. And so we've had an opportunity, thank God, to circle back and reclaim and redeem some of that time for him too. But he's on his own journey now, and he's 28 years old, thriving. He's getting married in November of next year. And so, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge how hard it was for him in the midst of all of that.
Yeah. And even in that turmoil too, I think what God does is, yes, he's experienced that, but now because of that reconciliation and kind of going back over with him, he has some of those tools. Like, he's going to get married. He already has that in place where, like you guys were saying earlier, you know, you got married. Nobody kind of shares, like, here's like some helpful, besides like just saying, yes, ma'am. Like, here's some stuff that actually like is meaningful. It is authentic. And I think that, as painful as that was, I'm sure for all of you, like, what was built upon that is so good. Sherry, I'd like to ask you, when you think back, you know, you had a moment where, like, is this for real? Like, is this actually happening? For someone who is walking through that, and there's like that what if that is always in the back of their mind, like, well, even if we reconcile, like, what if this happens again? What encouragement would you give to someone who's walking through that similar season?
Well, I think for me, knowing that part of what the wrestling was with God on divorce, not divorce, was not knowing what was going to come next. So in the what if it happens again, what if things go south, what if this isn't real, I knew that whatever might come would not change who I was, that I would be okay with or without Scott, that I'm a beloved daughter, that God cares for me deeply. He loves me so much. He is with me on my best day and in my deepest sorrow, and that I would be able to journey through the valley of the shadow of death, because I felt like I had done that already once before. And walking through that valley with him, although not what we choose, makes it bearable. It's funny because some people say, well, if this happens again, I'm out, I'm this, I'm that. And they make these decisions. And I have come to realize over 30 plus years of marriage that I can't make a plan like that. Yeah. Instead, I'd rather be curious when we stumble upon hiccups and things we don't agree on, and what feels like blow-ups and what feels wildly uncomfortable, moving in a posture of curiosity and asking good questions about what in the world are we experiencing? What are you hearing? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Tell me what you heard me say. Tell me what that experience was like for you, that you're responding this way. Or even for me, why am I so angry because he X, Y, or Z? What is it bumped into in my own story? What is it bumped into in my own wrestling? And Jesus, will you come alongside me in that? Will you give me clarity? Will you give me questions?
I just want to comment on that and say, when Sherry and I got back together and actually remarried, and I'll tell that part of the story in a moment, but when we got back together, we really were in this place of God can work anything out. There's hope for anyone. So you should stay married because God can work it out. Well, there is hope for anyone. Redemption is available for anyone, but that is not everyone's story. And I think we made the mistake early on in our ministry, and I think others have too. Let me just say it that way. When they say, you stay married no matter what. And I know it's till death do us part. And I know the biblical reasons why you can, you have a valid reason, air quotes, valid reason to get divorced. But I would say to anyone that's listening, if you're in a situation that's harmful, if you're in a situation that's dangerous, if you're in a situation that is untenable, I would say separation is an option for a period of time until counseling can be achieved, until a change of heart maybe can happen, and even divorce. If that needs to happen, it needed to happen in our story. Sherry was not safe with me at that time. I was not safe with myself. And so this idea that, you stay married at all costs, it's way more nuanced than that.
Right. So what I hear you describing is what we say at Zoweh. Walk with God. What's the answer to that? Walk with God. Ask Him.
I like what you said earlier, Sherry, about asking these questions, moving in a posture of curiosity. I'm going to put that on a plate somewhere. I mean, that is so helpful. Now, that is something that is learned over time, that is going to be molded. That is a huge behavior change for so many of us, because we aren't curious. We go back to where you felt like you were before, Sherry, where we are independent. This is what feels best for me. This is what I need. So that can be a real challenge. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'd love for you guys to tell me, what was your second wedding day like?
Yeah, so we spent about a year and a half in counseling and just kind of talking things through, trying to gain new tools to communicate with one another and be married. One that was really helpful in a fundamental kind of way was Marriage on the Rock by Jimmy Evans. It's a great resource. It's a little older now, but I still go back to it. And it taught me, if I can keep God in His place as the number one priority in my life, and Sherry right below Him, and then our children and our family and all of that below that, but God number one, our spouse number two, that was so crucial for me to understand that I still carry it with me to this day. So we were listening to curriculum like that, and we set a new date, which was May 5th of 2007.
It's just funny to me how we hear questions differently, because you went to that and I went immediately to, oh my gosh, it was so cool. We moved to this little tiny town in North Carolina and become friends with the mayor, and we got married on the front porch of a house we were restoring.
That's right.
A neighborhood couple threw a party for us, a pig picking, which we didn't know what that was coming from Connecticut. We're like, what does that mean? Yeah,
barbecue in Connecticut is an event. Barbecue here is an actual food in North Carolina. So it was very confusing. We got there and there's the whole pig right there on the grill, and it was a great experience.
Yeah, super simple, really beautiful day.
Stephen was there on the porch of the house we were remodeling together with us, and I felt like it was a simple day. There were some family and friends there, very small, very informal looking, but the ceremony, we just poured our hearts out to one another and our hopes and our dreams for the future. And really, I would say we didn't want to get away from our history and the story that got us to that porch in North Carolina. And we were led pretty early on to share our story transparently, because it's a part of how we got where we were and where we are now.
It's important to remember, I think sometimes when we think about history, whether that's for ourselves, our country, what have you, it's a lesson, it's a learning experience. It is a parable really within itself, where we're able to reflect and say, okay, this was totally God. This was where I messed up. And how can we change that for the future? How can we change that for Stephen, like you guys did? How can we, help couples going forward not make the same mistakes that we did? So I love that. I'd love for you guys to kind of discuss and talk about divorce in the church. I mean, for me, I was like, oh, wow, divorce, never. We should never do that. I'm never going to marry someone who's divorced. And here I am, married to somebody who has experienced the pain of that. And again, that's when we share our stories, we're able to have empathy and understand, where God was leading us and what he's teaching us. So I'd love your perspective of what was it like going into church, divorced, and then remarried?
Well, it feels like that's such a hard question for us because it feels like our season of being divorced was so short that really there was reconciliation within a couple of months. And so I was in Connecticut for that season, and I was in a church with the men and women who had been praying for our restoration, who had been praying for Scott's redemption, who had been praying for what I was starting to experience. Because it felt like we got married, even though it took us a year and a half to get remarried. Sure. We were together at that point.
Well, I would say that we got legally divorced on our 14th wedding anniversary, but I think we left each other quite a bit before that. And so there's the legal proceeding, and that certainly means something that is significant. But I think you can spiritually, emotionally, mentally divorce one another and still be legally married. And that was certainly our case.
Okay, so I can speak to that.
Okay, so speak to that.
Well, because I started that small group, and then it was a year and almost a year and a half in that not quite legally divorced, but us definitely in very different places to the point where physically you were living with your girlfriend and I was walking with Jesus, going to church by myself. And it is lonely and it is hard. And I have to say, it was just an incredible church that wrapped me up and loved me really well in the midst of that. And, there was no pressure from the people that I was with to divorce or to stay married. It really was a walk with God experience, and let's see what he's going to do in the midst of this, which I imagine is unusual.
Danielle, I would say to comment on the divorce in the church, just generally speaking, when we went into the church, found a church after we moved to North Carolina and got remarried, we were led to share our story pretty transparently. And so we were invited to, we told the pastor our story because we wanted to start a small group to encourage marriages. He said, well, we're going to be doing this thing called a cardboard testimony, and I'd love for you guys to share your testimony. So, the cardboard testimony is you get a small piece of cardboard and you write the before Jesus on one side and after Jesus on the other. And ours said adultery and control and dishonor and all that, divorced. And then we flipped it over, and the story of being remarried, redemption, it was on the other side. And so we were kind of out there from the get-go in our church as the people who had been divorced. And it took a little while for us to get an opportunity to share our story a little more clearly so that people understood we divorced each other and then remarried each other. That was about the time we came up with the catchphrase that our divorce just didn't work out, which confused some folks, right? But glory to God, it didn't. And so we were able to encourage some folks. And what we found out through having that opportunity and being put in that position in the church of leading small groups was that there's just a ton of shame associated with being divorced, even being the children of divorced parents. We saw that too. I mean, there's just shame and guilt and embarrassment, and I don't want to talk about it because, I'm somehow unclean now. I mean, and what I would say about that is that's like blaming a civilian who gets injured in the course of a war for their injury. Yeah. They're not a combatant in the war and they're injured. Let's say they take a piece of shrapnel to the leg or whatever, and they're obviously injured. That's like blaming that person for not knowing that that injury was going to come, or they should have avoided it somehow. Because I believe that divorce is a major tool that the enemy, Satan, uses against us in his war against the world, and particularly against Christians. And so blaming the victims is not helpful.
So good, Scott. Thank you for sharing that. Guys, you are you've worked on a project. It's called The Rendezvous Story. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the Rendezvous Project was a resource that actually started as a in-person weekend, probably about 2010 or so, in response to Zoweh's men's weekends. So men were coming to the Heart of a Warrior Encounter weekend and then experiencing God, having these mountaintop moments and intimacy with him, and then going home to a wife who had no idea what he was talking about. And at the time, they were kind of a large group of those men were kind of clamoring, like, how do we bring our wives in? How do we get our wives in this message? And so we developed the Rendezvous Weekend as an opportunity to do that, to bring wives in and couples in, to introduce them to the Zoweh's message from God of love, life, and freedom.
Right, because although we have a women's weekend, the deepening weekend for women, it's not always the most helpful for the husband to go home and say, honey, you got to go get your heart back.
Yeah. I had this amazing experience. Well. You need it too. Go do that.
Yes.
Go get fixed somehow.
Yeah.
And early on, the women's initiative was not as robust as it is today. And so we did those in-person weekends for a number of years, and they were small. They were,
intimate.
Very intimate, probably 12 to 15, maybe it's sometimes 20 couples. And so Sherry and I came into Zoweh in 2016, and part of our history with Family Life Ministry is that we took their resource called The Art of Marriage, and we made it into an event where we used a video-based resource and invited people to different locations and shared the great video content with them. So with that experience under our belt, we joined Zoweh and said, man, this Rendezvous Project, if we're going to reach folks with this message of redemption and the importance, there's 2 whole sessions in this resource where I listen for over an hour to Sherry tell her story. And then she listens to me, and you spend over an hour doing it, telling my story. Story is such a core part of it, and our life experience and our history. Oftentimes we found, married couples have come to or experienced the Rendezvous Project resource, and they've been married for decades, and they learn things about each other that they never knew before. So story is core to that. But we came into Zoweh and we said, man, we got to make this a resource that's reproducible so that people all over the world can take hold of it and get to know each other better and put God at the center of their marriage and learn to walk with him.
And I loved, there was one of the last weekends that we had, where it was a physical weekend with speakers. There was a couple there that had been married 50 years. And they were like, we don't even know why we're here. I already know everything about her.
The first day, yeah. We've been married 50 years. We could teach this class,
But come Sunday morning, the husband was weeping over what his wife was able to share in that time, because the content invites you to explore some spaces in your story that maybe you haven't even thought about or considered in a long time, if ever. And so for him to get to hear his wife talk about some of her childhood experiences that he had no idea,
never heard before,
he was heartbroken for her. There was a whole new level of intimacy between the two of them that, it blew him away, blew them both away. And so to be able to offer that, and we've had different couples who have been taking this and offering it as a retreat in different locations across the country. And so being able to come alongside them and encourage them as they are caring for and inviting couples to explore their stories and their intimacy with God feels redeeming each time.
And there's tools included in there for the Enneagram. There's communication tools, things like that as well. So,
guys, thank you so much for sharing this. I do have one more question. You can both answer this or just one of you. I'd love for you to think back to that keg party back at Yukon. And, sometimes when if God was able just to download everything to you in that moment and say, when you see each other, this is what is going to happen, and you can choose to erase anything or keep it the same. I'd love to know what you would do in that moment. If that was an opportunity, would you erase anything?
I don't know that I would change a thing, because every pain that we've experienced, every heartache, every wound that we've both caused each other and experienced has become more and more an opportunity for intimacy, to be curious, to get to know each other more. I mean, even after 30 years, even after all the work that we've done on our own hearts and stories, it feels like there's so much more. And And I hope I have lots of years with you to continue to explore and love you better.
I'm with Sherry. I don't think I would change anything. I think of our lives as, maybe it sounds a little corny, but I think of it as a tapestry. And if you pull one thread out of the middle of that, I don't know what other threads would get pulled out. And maybe we're not sitting with you here today. And even in the pain that we experienced, and honestly, we're not perfect people. We still hurt each other. There's still pain involved, right? I recently was speaking to a friend of mine, and she said, anytime there's humans involved, there's an opportunity for failure. So we fail each other. We fail one another all the time. Yeah, and I'm thinking now specifically, Danielle, about someone that might be listening that is going through maybe the most painful part of their lives. I would just say to that person now that God is still in control. God is sovereign. He sees your pain. He catches your tears. I'd encourage you to look for Jesus in the midst of what you're going through. I know that maybe that sounds trite. I hope it doesn't. It's not my heart for it too, but it's been our experience looking back at painful times of our lives to get to look back with him and see where he was and what he was doing in the midst of it has been an incredible privilege. And so I wouldn't change a thing.
And I would just add to that, since you're speaking to listeners who might be in pain, don't run from the pain. Don't stuff it. Don't tuck it away. Experience what you're experiencing. Stay present to it and reach out for the care that you need in the midst of it, because we're learning more and more. And feels like a new season. We have the capacity to hold the good and the hard, the joy and the sorrow. We have the capacity to do that. It doesn't feel like we do. It doesn't necessarily feel good, but we were created to feel all of it in our experiences.
What you just said I know you're trying
to keep doing this all day.
Yeah, I know. We keep going. We could go all day. But the quote who's from the person I can't remember, of course, in the moment, when you're looking to come out of the painful times, running away from the darkness, right? Running to the west doesn't bring you to the light. Head east into the darkness, and that's where the light is found.
Jerry Sitzer.
Jerry Sitzer. Thank you.
There you
See,
go.
we complete one another.
Well, Scott and Sherry Jennings, this has been just a joy. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It is a beautiful testimony of what God will continue to do when we feel like we're running from the darkness, right? He has restored it and just made you like a bridegroom. So it's beautiful. I love it so much. If you guys want to get connected to Scott and Sherry or Zoweh and any of their resources, they would be happy to do that. All of their information will be in today's show notes. Scott and Sherry, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Danielle.
Wow, right? God is so good at working in the hearts of each one of us. And that is an impactful story for both Scott and Sherry. To connect with the Jennings or find out more about the Rendezvous Project, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Scott and Sherry. Number 1, whether married or not, it doesn't take much for us to get a little off track, right, in our relationship with God. So in a time with God, ask him, is there an area in your life, maybe it is an emotion or an attitude even, that is causing you to go off track? Number 2, who is it that God wants you to move into a posture of curiosity with this week? So maybe that is your spouse. Maybe that is a friendship. Maybe that is a coworker, where we have to build and strengthen this muscle of creativity, curiosity, just asking some questions. One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing it with a friend. If you could pass along this episode today, that really helps people find out about these fantastic stories like Scott and Sherry's. And thank you to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for his top-notch editing skills. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God redeems relationships. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.